The crystal glass was cold against his fingertips. Akio Tanaka watched a single bead of condensation trace a path down its side, a slow, deliberate journey toward the pristine white linen. He had been watching it for 7 minutes. At 10, he would leave. Punctuality was a form of respect. Lateness, a declaration of contempt. The arrangement had been an absurdity from the start, a concession to the old men in his organization who believed a wife would soften his image, make him seem more stable, less like the razor's edge he truly was. He had agreed, imagining a woman of quiet breeding and calculated smiles, someone who understood the architecture of silence. He had not imagined being stood up. The low hum of the Shinjuku restaurant, a symphony of quiet wealth and clinking silverware, was beginning to grate on his nerves. He signaled a waiter with a glance, his hand already moving toward the tailored jacket of his Tom Ford suit resting on the adjacent chair. That was when the doors to the restaurant slid open with a jarring whoosh of hydraulic pressure, admitting a gust of city air and a woman who was the absolute antithesis of the room. She was a whirlwind of light blue polyester and frantic energy. Her hair was a cloud of tight, dark coils pulled back from her face, a few errant strands clinging to her temples. She wore nurse's scrubs, the fabric inexpensive and slightly wrinkled. An old, worn leather sling bag was hiked high on her shoulder, its strap cutting across her chest. She scanned the room, her eyes wide and panicked, until they landed on him, the only man sitting alone at a table for two. Her name was Imani Carter, and she was 28 minutes late. She rushed toward the table, a blur of apologies already forming on her lips before she even arrived. Heads turned. A woman dripping in pearls at a nearby table lowered her champagne flute, her expression a perfect mask of disdain. Imani ignored them all, her focus solely on the man whose stillness was a stark contrast to her chaos. "I am so sorry," she breathed, her chest heaving slightly. She didn't sit, just stood beside the table, clutching the strap of her bag. There was a pile-up on the expressway, a bad one. We were short-staffed. I couldn't get away. "I'm sorry, I wore my work uniform. I didn't have time to change." "I completely understand if you want to leave." Akio looked at her. He took in the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to her, the exhaustion that shadowed her dark, intelligent eyes, the smudge of what looked like ink on her forearm. She was not the curated perfection he had been expecting. She was real, messy, and, for some reason he could not immediately articulate, infinitely more interesting. He slowly withdrew his hand from his jacket. With a deliberate, almost imperceptible gesture, he indicated the empty chair opposite him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She held his gaze, her breath held tight in her lungs. "I still want our date," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly timbre that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the room.
"Please. See."
The tension in her shoulders eased, but only slightly. She slid into the chair, placing her worn bag on the floor beside her. She felt like a crow that had wandered into a garden of peacocks. The man across from her was carved from shadow and steel. His suit was a masterpiece of dark gray wool, his white shirt impossibly crisp. A sliver of intricate, dark ink peeked from beneath his left cuff, a dragon's tail, coiling around his wrist. His eyes, a deep, obsidian black, missed nothing. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now.
"I'm Imani."
"Akio," he replied. He did not offer a surname. A waiter appeared as if summoned by telepathy, pouring her a glass of water with a reverence that seemed completely at odds with her appearance. Akio watched her hands as she lifted the glass. They were capable hands, her nails short and clean. The hands of someone who worked. "A nurse?" he asked. It was not a question so much as a confirmation. She nodded, taking a small sip. "At St. Luke's International. Long-term care ward. A difficult job. It has its moments," she admitted. "Both good and bad." "And you?" "Our mutual friend, Mrs. Watanabe, said you were in acquisitions." A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Of a sort. I acquire assets. Territories. Loyalties." The words hung in the air, meaning something more than their simple definition. Imani had lived in Tokyo for 3 years, long enough to understand that the city had layers, some of which were best left undisturbed. She had a feeling she was sitting at a table directly on top of one of them. She told herself it was just a date, a favor to a sweet old woman who was a patient on her ward. Get through the meal, be polite, and go home to her tiny apartment and 2.5 hours of sleep before her next shift. But his eyes held hers, and she felt a strange, unsettling pull. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost predatory. When he picked up his fork, it was a single fluid act. When he spoke, every word felt weighed and measured. He radiated a kind of absolute authority she had only ever seen in chief surgeons during a crisis. He asked her about her life in America, why she'd come to Japan. She found herself telling him about the nursing scholarship, about her love for the quiet order of the city, the way you could find a silent, ancient shrine nestled between two glittering skyscrapers. She spoke more than she intended to, unnerved by his focused silence. He listened, his head tilted slightly, as if he were memorizing every word, filing it away for later analysis. She did not know yet that his silence was a weapon, a tool he used to unmake other men. She did not know that the ink on his skin was not a fashion statement, but an oath written in blood. What she did know was that the air around their table had grown thick with a tension that had nothing to do with a blind date. It felt like the calm before a storm. That was the moment everything changed. It began not with a bang, but with a sharp, percussive crack of shattering glass. The magnificent floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city exploded inward, a glittering wave of destruction. Screams erupted. Patrons dove under tables, a chaotic scramble of silks and jewels. Imani's training took over. Her adrenaline surged, but it was a cold, focused rush, not panic. She dropped to the floor, her eyes scanning for the source of the threat. 3 men in dark, ill-fitting suits stepped through the shattered frame. They moved with a clumsy aggression, a stark contrast to Akio's surgical precision. They held knives, the polished steel glinting in the dim restaurant lighting. Akio hadn't flinched. He was on his feet before the first shard of glass had hit the floor, pulling her down behind the heavy linen-draped table with one strong hand on her arm. He moved like the room owed him space. He shielded her body with his own, his presence a solid, unyielding wall. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear, so close she could feel the vibration in his chest. His own men, 2 of them who had been seated discreetly at the bar, materialized from the chaos. They were armed, their movements swift and professional. The fight was brutal and blessedly short. It was not a brawl, it was an execution. Akio did not participate directly, but he orchestrated it with a flick of his eyes, a subtle gesture of his hand. He was the conductor of this symphony of violence. One of the attackers, desperate, lunged past Akio's men, his knife aimed for Akio's back. But a waiter, a young man who had just refilled their water, stumbled into his path. The knife plunged into the waiter's side with a sickening thud. The young man crumpled to the ground, a cry of shock and pain cut short. Without thinking, Imani moved. "No." Akio's hand shot out, grabbing her arm, but she twisted away. "He's bleeding out," she snapped, her professional instincts overriding every shred of self-preservation. She scrambled to the waiter's side, her worn sling bag bumping against her. She ripped at the clean linen napkins on a nearby table, pressing them hard against the wound. "Put pressure here," she ordered a terrified busboy who was hiding behind the dessert cart. "Don't let up." Her hands were quick and sure, assessing the damage, her mind racing through protocols. The wound was deep. He was going into shock. From the corner of her eye, she saw the last of the attackers fall. The entire incident had lasted less than a minute. The restaurant was a wreck of overturned tables, shattered glass, and terrified silence. Akio stood in the center of it, untouched, his suit still immaculate. His gaze was fixed on her. He watched her work, her face a mask of intense concentration, her voice calm and authoritative as she gave instructions. He saw a competence, a refusal to be paralyzed by fear, that he had not seen in anyone outside of his own world. His men were securing the scene, their voices low and urgent. An ambulance had been called, but the police would follow.
Questions would be asked.
And she, the nurse in the light blue scrubs, had seen everything. He walked over to her, his polished shoes crunching softly on the broken glass. He crouched down beside her, his presence eclipsing everything else. "He will live," Akio stated, his eyes on her blood-stained hands. "He will if he gets to an operating room in the next 10 minutes, she replied without looking up. The distant wail of sirens grew closer. Akio's men were already escorting the other patrons out through a back exit, their methods of persuasion both quiet and non-negotiable. Akio's hand settled on her shoulder. It was not a comforting gesture.
It was a claim.
"The paramedics are here. You have done enough." She finally looked at him, then really looked at him. The polite facade from dinner was gone. In its place was something cold, hard, and absolute. The man who acquired territories and loyalties. The head of the Tanakagumi. The most dangerous man in Shinjuku. "You have to go," she said, her voice low. "The police." "We have to go," he corrected her, his grip tightening just enough to convey that it was not a request. "You are a witness. More than that, you are now a complication. My enemies have seen your face." Her blood ran cold. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a movie. This was real. The sirens were screaming outside, a sound that moments ago meant help was coming, but now felt like a cage closing around her. He stood, pulling her to her feet with an irresistible strength. "You will come with me. It is the only way you will remain safe." "Safe," she whispered, incredulous, looking at the carnage around them. "This is safe. Safer than being left behind," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He led her away from the wounded waiter, toward a service exit his men had cleared. The choice was not hers to make. The moment she had rushed into that restaurant, her fate had been sealed. She was his complication now. And Akio Tanaka always dealt with his complications personally. The drive was silent, a blur of neon and concrete as the black Lexus sliced through the Tokyo night. Imani sat rigid in the plush leather seat, her mind struggling to process the whiplash of the last hour. From a frantic end-of-shift to a fine dining restaurant to a knife fight. And now this. Kidnapped by a Yakuza boss. Her friend, Mrs. Watanabe, was going to get an earful, assuming Imani ever saw her again. They arrived at a residential skyscraper that pierced the clouds, its facade a sleek wall of dark glass and steel. The private elevator ascended without a sound, opening directly into a sprawling penthouse. The space was minimalist to the point of being sterile. Polished concrete floors, vast windows showcasing a panoramic view of the city, and sparse, brutally modern furniture. It was less a home and more a beautiful, empty fortress. Akio gestured toward a sprawling black leather sofa. "Sit." He shed his jacket, draping it over a chair. The movement revealed a glimpse of the intricate tattoo work that covered his entire back and shoulders, a tapestry of myth and menace. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing a long, shallow cut on his forearm, beaded with blood. A souvenir from the attacker who had gotten too close. He ignored it, moving to a wet bar to pour 2 glasses of whiskey. He set one on the low table in front of her. "My rivals," he said, his back to her as he stared out at the city lights. "The Kudokai. They grow bold." They mistook a social engagement for a moment of weakness. He turned, his dark eyes pinning her to the sofa. "They saw you with me. In their eyes, that makes you a target. A liability. My liability." Imani stared at the amber liquid in her glass. "So, what happens now? You just keep me here?" "Until the threat is neutralized," he confirmed. "It is cleaner this way." Cleaner. The word was so cold, so clinical. She looked at the cut on his arm. "You're bleeding." He glanced at it as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It is nothing. It needs to be cleaned," she said, the nurse in her rising again, a familiar instinct in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unfamiliar. "Where is your first aid kit?" He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a curt nod toward a door. Bathroom. Through there. She found a well-stocked, impersonal medical kit. When she returned, he was sitting on the sofa, waiting. She knelt on the floor in front of him, her light blue scrubs stark against the black leather. She worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with an antiseptic wipe. Her touch was professional, detached. But the proximity was undeniable. She was so close she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the almost invisible scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of cedar and smoke, filled her senses. He didn't move a muscle, just watched her, his stillness a palpable force. As she worked, a memory surfaced, a ghost in the starkly modern room. "My sister," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough. "She was a doctor. She used to tend to my injuries when I was younger." Before, he stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. It was the first crack in his armor, a glimpse of a wound far deeper than the one on his arm. A woman he had failed to protect. Imani finished applying a sterile bandage, her fingers brushing against his skin. The contact sent a jolt through her, a strange current of awareness. His skin was warm. He was just a man, flesh and blood. A very dangerous man, but a man nonetheless. She packed up the kit, her movements suddenly clumsy. He gave her an out, a small test. His phone buzzed, and he stood to take the call, walking over to the window. He spoke in rapid, low Japanese, his voice hard as iron. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of death being ordered. She was alone in the main room. The elevator was there. The door to the apartment wasn't locked. She could run. Every rational part of her brain screamed at her to take the chance, to flee back to her simple, orderly life. But she looked at the blood she had just cleaned from his arm. She thought of the way he had shielded her in the restaurant. She thought of the rival clan who now had her face memorized. Running would be a death sentence. Staying was a gamble. She made her choice. When Akio finished his call and turned around, she was still there, sitting on the edge of the sofa, waiting. She hadn't run. He walked back over, his eyes searching her face. "You are not afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm too tired to be afraid," she answered honestly, the exhaustion of her double shift crashing over her. "Fear is a luxury, and I'm fresh out." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. He picked up the whiskey glass he had poured for her and held it out. "You have courage," he said. "It is a rare commodity, and often a fatal 1-inch." The rehook came sooner than either of them expected. The phone call had been from his lieutenant, Sato. They had acquired the security footage from the restaurant. The Kudokai would have it by now, too. They had a clear image of her face. The problem was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. "They know who you are," Akio said, his voice clipped. "They know where you work. They will be watching your apartment." The floor dropped out from under her. Her small, safe space, the one place in this sprawling city that was hers, was now a trap. "We have to move," he said.
Now.
There was no time to gather anything. He simply took her by the arm and led her to a different elevator, one that descended into a subterranean parking garage. A different car was waiting, a nondescript sedan. This time, he drove himself. The city was a hostile landscape now, every shadow a potential threat. Imani found herself scanning the traffic, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was his world. A world of constant vigilance, of unseen enemies. They were on a quiet side street in Ginza when it happened. A black van, which had been 2 cars behind them, suddenly accelerated, ramming their rear bumper. The sedan fishtailed. Akio corrected with an expert's calm, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Another car appeared, boxing them in from the front. An ambush. "Get down," he yelled, and this time, there was urgency in his voice. He wrenched the wheel, forcing the car onto the sidewalk, scraping against a building. Gunshots erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The passenger side window spiderwebbed with cracks as a bullet struck it, inches from Imani's head. Akio shoved her down, his body covering hers as he steered with one hand, his other reaching into the glove compartment and pulling out a sleek, black handgun. The intimacy of the moment was terrifying. His weight pressing her into the seat, the smell of gunpowder and his cologne, the solid, steady beat of his heart against her ear. He was a shield of muscle and resolve. He found an alley, a narrow gap between two buildings, and plunged the car into the darkness. He killed the engine. They were trapped. Footsteps pounded against the pavement outside, getting closer. Two men appeared at the mouth of the alley, guns raised. Akio fired twice through the shattered windshield.
Precise.
Economical. One man fell. The other took cover. Another appeared on her side of the car, yanking on the handle. The door was locked. He raised his gun to smash the already cracked window. There was no time. Akio was focused on the man at the front. Imani's hand flew to her sling bag, her fingers searching for something, anything. They closed around a familiar shape. A pre-filled syringe of lorazepam, a powerful sedative she carried for combative, delirious patients. It was a violation of half a dozen hospital policies, but it had saved her from being assaulted by a dementia patient just last week.
She didn't hesitate. She didn't think.
She acted. As the man shattered the window, reaching in to grab her, she jammed the syringe into his exposed forearm, depressing the plunger fully. His eyes widened in shock, first at the needle, then as the drug hit his system with the force of a freight train. His grip on her slackened. His eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the pavement. The alley went silent. The other attacker had fled. Akio looked over at her. He saw the syringe still in her trembling hand. He saw the unconscious man on the ground. He saw her face, pale but resolute. She had just crossed a line. She had stepped out of her world and into his, using the tools of healing to do harm. She had not screamed. She had not frozen. She had survived. He reached over and gently took the syringe from her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers for a second. The touch was electric. They abandoned the car, slipping through the back alleys and labyrinthine streets of Tokyo. He never let go of her hand. An hour later, they were in another anonymous apartment, this one smaller, more functional. A safe house. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep tremor. She sank onto a cheap sofa, her work uniform now torn and stained. Akio stood over her, watching her. The silence was different now.
Charged.
"My world is poison," he said, his voice low and raw. "It taints everything it touches. Why do you not run from it?" Imani looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. She thought of the life she had, the quiet order and predictable exhaustion. It felt a million miles away, a lifetime ago. "I was told this was a blind date," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I didn't realize it meant I'd be walking in blind to a war." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am not blind anymore." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. An acceptance. A confession that she saw the monster clearly, and for reasons she didn't yet understand, she was still here. The final confrontation was inevitable. The Kudokai boss, a man named Ryuichi, was losing face. His men had failed twice. He grew desperate, and desperate men are predictable. He found Akio's pressure point, Imani. Sato, Akio's lieutenant, was taken. The message was simple and delivered through a bloody, brutalized messenger, a trade. The woman for his man. At the old fish market in Tsukiji at dawn. "It's a trap," Imani said, watching Akio absorb the news with a terrifying stillness. "He'll kill them both." "I know," Akio said. He was checking the magazine of his handgun, the click of the metal precise and final. "Which is why we will not be making a trade." His plan was simple, brutal, and relied on one thing: Ryuichi underestimating her. They would go to the meeting, but not as supplicants. As hunters. Dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and bruised purple. The abandoned fish market smelled of salt, rust, and decay. Ryuichi was there, surrounded by his remaining soldiers. Sato was on his knees, his face swollen and bloody. Akio and Imani walked into the cavernous space alone. It was a deliberate show of arrogance, designed to infuriate Ryuichi. "Tanaka," Ryuichi spat, his eyes alight with manic triumph. He gestured with his gun toward Imani. "You brought the stray. A weakness I did not know you possessed." Akio's face was a granite mask. "Let him go, Ryuichi. End this." "It ends when I say it ends," Ryuichi screamed, pressing the gun to Sato's head. "First, she comes to me. A down payment for your man's life." Imani looked at Akio. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This was her part. She had to act. She had to be the distraction. She walked forward, her steps even, her hands held up to show they were empty. She kept her eyes on Ryuichi, her expression a careful blend of fear and submission. She knew he saw her as nothing more than a pawn, a helpless foreign woman caught in a world she didn't understand. She would use that. As she drew close, she let her knees buckle, stumbling forward with a small cry. It was perfectly executed. Ryuichi's attention shifted to her for a fraction of a second, a sneer on his face as he reached out to grab her. In that moment of distraction, Imani's hand darted into the pocket of her borrowed jacket. It wasn't a gun she held. It was a pair of surgical scissors she'd taken from the safe house's first aid kit. Small, sharp, and deadly. As Ryuichi's hand closed on her arm, she brought the scissors up in a vicious arc, plunging the pointed blades deep into the back of his hand, the one holding the gun. He roared in pain and shock, his fingers spasming open. The gun clattered to the concrete floor. It was the only opening Akio needed. The world exploded in controlled chaos. Gunshots echoed through the market as Akio's men, hidden in the shadows, opened fire. Akio himself moved forward, a wraith of lethal intent. The fight was over in seconds. Ryuichi's men fell. Ryuichi himself lay on the ground, clutching his ruined hand, staring up into Akio's cold, merciless eyes. But victory had a cost. In the crossfire, Sato had been hit again, a bullet to the chest. Imani was at his side instantly, applying pressure, her voice a stream of calm commands to the other men. But it was too late. His breathing was shallow, his eyes already glazing over. He looked at Akio, a faint, bloody smile on his lips, and then he was gone. The debt of blood was always paid. The aftermath was silent, save for the distant sound of the city waking up. Akio stood over Ryuichi's body for a long moment before turning to Imani. She was still kneeling beside Sato, her hands covered in his blood. He walked to her, his shadow falling over her. He crouched, reaching out to touch her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a streak of grime. Her skin was cold. He said her name, and the way he said it was different than anyone else ever had.
It was not a sound.
It was a possession. Imani. He looked from her face to the body of his most loyal man, and then back to her. The cost and the prize all in one place. "Your place is here," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "With me." It was not a question. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact. A claim staked in blood and chaos. They were back in the penthouse. The sun was fully up now, glinting off the endless glass and steel of the Tokyo skyline. Imani had showered, the water washing away the blood and grime of the fish market, but she knew it could never wash away the memory. She wore a simple black silk dress that had been left for her. Her scrubs, the last relic of her old life, were gone. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, looking not at the city, but at her own reflection. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her eyes were older, haunted. The exhaustion was still there, but it was overlaid with something new. Something hard and unbreakable that had been forged in fear and violence. She heard him approach, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He came to stand behind her, his presence a solid wall at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. For a long moment, they both just stared at their reflections, two solitary figures against the backdrop of a sprawling, indifferent city. Then, His hand came to rest on the small of her back. The touch was light, but it was an anchor, a brand. A final, unspoken declaration.
She did not pull away.
She did not flinch. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness, she saw the glint of a knife, felt the weight of his body shielding hers, heard the sharp, shocking crack of a syringe. Her old world was gone, burned away in a single night. This was what was left. This man, this city, this dangerous, uncertain life. She took a slow breath, the borrowed silk cool against her skin, and leaned back ever so slightly into his touch. The choice had been made.